Thank you,
30 minutes.
The Irish people have shown time and time again that they are willing to accept hard choices. They understand that there is no easy way out of an unprecedented crisis which has engulfed Ireland, much of Europe and indeed the world in recent years. However, their support is based on measures meeting two core principles. They want budgets which are fair and which make a clear contribution to returning growth and job creation. This budget fails on both measures. Last year, having won a mandate from the people promising a radical and progressive government, Fine Gael and Labour choose to abandon their promises to the people and actually introduce by far the most regressive and unfair budget in many years, independently assessed as such. This year, they have done it again. In some cases, it even looks like ministers sat down to see if they could find new ways of making sure that the most vulnerable suffered more. To take only one example, how else can you explain first cutting home help and then cutting respite care? Ceann, in the ever-growing mountain of documents and press releases which have accompanied this year's budget, one thing is already clear. This is a deeply unfair budget, presented by a government which has no strategy for growth and job creation other than hoping that something will turn up. Driven purely by the short-term political tactics of competing parties, it systematically betrays election promises, places the heaviest burden on those who are least able to bear it, and will further damage confidence, which is essential for recovery. Yet again, Labour and Fine Gael used true, half-true and completely false leaks during negotiations. Their growing band of Malcolm Tucker wannabes were constantly on the phone to journalists, briefing for and against different ministers and talking up the resolve of their parties. Now we know that for all of the tough talk from the Labour Party, the ongoing muttering from its backbenchers and the soothing words of their ministers, Labour has once again been shafted. On the other hand, Fine Gael used every tactic it could muster in an ultimately successful mood to protect the highest earners from taking more of the load. It was a direct trade-off. Every one of the regressive welfare cuts could have been avoided with the increase in universal social charge for the highest earners, which has widespread, by the way, political and public support. Fine Gael should have the honesty to explain why it demanded that supports for the poorest families be cut rather than hit those who earn the most. For all of its smug sense of having prevailed over its coalition partner, Fine Gael also has to explain why it didn't lift a finger to try and stop a family home tax which the Taoiseach himself once described, and I quote, as unjust, immoral and illegal, unquote. No, we didn't. No, we did not. In the memorandum of understanding, a completely different kind of tax to the one you've introduced.
Deputy Martin.
After nearly 2 years in office, the only government strategy evident this week is a public relations strategy. The government has been putting its trust in the idea that people won't compare the claims they're making.
Deputy Martin has the floor, please.
Taoiseach, I didn't interrupt you. With the greatest respect, I'd appreciate the opportunity to make my contribution to the House. The government has been putting its trust in the idea that people won't compare the claims they are making with the substance with what they have decided to do. Most ministers have been making claims which are the direct opposite of the truth and have been using unprecedented gimmicks to try and cover up the hard reality of their choices. Over the next few weeks, ministers will have to explain exactly what is involved in many of the general, quote, adjustments in their allocations. At that point, there is no doubt that we will find many more unfair, damaging and avoidable cuts. However, from what is already known, there is more than enough to see the mean spirit and lack of direction which lie at the heart of this budget. The overall fiscal framework for next year is widely accepted, and we believe that it is the correct one. It did not, Taoiseach, originate from the Troika. It is a required next step in bringing the deficit to a sustainable level. As the budget documentation points out, the major part of the fiscal adjustment was done in previous years, next year and the year after being relatively easier. We're all somewhat amused by the Taoiseach's use of the word that we're 85% there, given that the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach and his parties voted against 80% of that journey, every single measure that was proposed year after year in this House. And always saying to the people that there was a better way, an easier way, and so on. And that's what Labour and Fine Gael said before the election, made reckless commitments and promises which it could not fulfil. While the targets are correct, there is now serious reason to believe that they might not be met. And also that public support for the targets has been undermined by the crass and growing inequity of the decisions being taken by government. A new concern is that these targets may not be met because of a combination of overspending and reduced revenue. In spite of government claims of having an iron hand on spending, including Minister Howland's repeated claims that everyone would stay within budget, the two largest departments are showing major overruns for this year. The inclusion of large amounts in unspecified savings for these departments for next year suggests that exactly the same thing will happen again. On the revenue side, last week's figures showed a serious undershooting of key taxes, but in particular the 300 million deficit in income tax receipts. For 2012, the combination of overspending and low receipts has been able to be covered up with a number of once-off measures, and the benefit of the Greek interest rate deal being automatically passed to all countries. This will not be available next year, and there is no reason to believe that this year's problems have been effectively tackled. One of the most striking things about the budget is how little it actually has to say about the economy. Beyond empty generalities, there is no analysis of the direction of the growth or employment. There is no discussion of the impact of the budget on any economic indicator. There is no attempt to set out anything which updates plans made 2 years ago. In a major departure from tradition, most economic projections were relegated to appendices which the ministers didn't mention. It is there that you find the detail of a government which has already missed every one of its targets for broad economic indicators. Every one of its targets. This year, the targeted growth of 2.5% will actually be less than 1%. The target of 3% growth for next year has now been halved. These are not cold, irrelevant statistics. They have a very real impact on people's lives, particularly in employment. And that's why they weren't mentioned in the ministers' speeches. Last year, the government said it was all about jobs, jobs, jobs. It had a jobs budget, which it downgraded to an initiative, and the budget speech was almost entirely given over to claims of jobs on the way. Minister Noonan predicted a growth in employment of 0.5% for this year. The reality is minus 1.2%. He predicted a fall in unemployment to 13.7%. It will be nearly 15%. Yesterday, all that Minister Noonan had to say about the failure to hit any major economic target was that everything is Europe's fault. When you were talking to the Minister Taoiseach, I outlined all the targets that have been missed by your government this year from last year's budget on. And of course, to blame Europe for everything is simply untrue in the context of the Minister's speech. The government's policies have had a direct impact in reducing growth and employment. Front-loading a major VAT increase, removing investment funds from the economy by an enormous levy on pension funds, and threatening employers with extra costs for every employee were amongst the measures which helped drive down domestic demand and confidence, the two things our economy needs most if it is to recover. In this debate last year, you were told that implementing these policies would damage the economy, but you went ahead with the measures anyway. Let no one be in any doubt, the policies of this government have directly damaged domestic confidence and thereby reduced both growth and employment during this year. They will do so again next year, unless there is a significant external growth which drags us up with it. What is also striking is that the government is silent on the vital issue of debt sustainability. We are apparently seeking a deal to make our debt sustainable, but no member of the government has yet said what they believe we need our debt to be at in order to be sustainable. Domestic demand and confidence are the most important things which we require to build a strong recovery. But the situation in Europe is also extremely important. To date, the government's approach to Europe has been to hope that others win concessions, which will be automatically extended to us. Every development has been overspun and under-delivered. Getting a substantial deal to reschedule the promissory notes would provide significant extra resources. Ireland's case is extremely strong. As the Taoiseach finally admitted in October, and I quote, Ireland was the first and only country which had a European position imposed upon it in the sense that there wasn't the opportunity, if the government so wished, to do it their way by burning bondholders, unquote. In spite of the claims made since June, nothing was agreed in relation to Ireland's debts, and the news this week from Brussels marks a significant setback. The German minister explicitly stated that he did not intend supporting Ireland and Portugal getting major concessions, and the banking union, which was supposed to be operating from January and which is essential for our banks, has been delayed to some unspecified time. Given how important Europe is, after nearly 2 years in office, it is time for the government to set out a policy on Europe, which goes beyond hoping something turns up which can be claimed as a great victory. The number of promises broken by both parties in this budget is even larger than anyone imagined. The defence which has been trotted out is the usual one, that they've been forced to break their promises because circumstances changed. In reality, the only thing that has changed is that Fine Gael and Labour are in government, and their reckless campaign to win votes have left them having to justify the systematic abandonment of pre-election promises. The budgetary constraints faced by this government were fully known to Fine Gael and Labour before they made their promises. In fact, last year the situation was ahead of what was targeted. No one forced you to make those promises, and no one is forcing you to break them. The overpowering cynicism of their campaigns is summed up best when you look at Labour's "every little hurts." In the closing days of the campaign, you remember it well, Taoiseach, Labour decided that it needed to attack Fine Gael. So it drew up a list of cuts and extra charges it said would happen if Fine Gael got in without Labour to stop them. The report card now shows, Taoiseach, that every one of those cuts and charges have been delivered.
Well done.
They even went so far at the time as to say that there were red lines. There were red lines which they would never cross. I think everybody should play back that interview that Eamon Gilmore gave to RTE about child benefit. He was categoric. He was absolute about it. Absolute about it. And we also remember,
Deputies.
remember the response of Deputy Noonan at the time, when he did a press conference, where, in fairness, he had journalists rolling in the aisles as he found new and creative ways to dismiss Labour's warnings as empty scaremongering. How right he was. Today, in the context of their capacity to stop any of this from happening, today, less than 2 years later, we know that every little does hurt, because they've already implemented everything they said they would never do. Because of the mounting wave of negative commentary about its regressive policies and its lack of any real innovation in nearly 2 years, the government yesterday unveiled a new tactic. This involves changing the baselines wherever it might give a better result. In some areas, the government thinks it can claim success, so it talks about what has happened since March 2011. However, in most areas, it has started using earlier dates to present a better picture. Yesterday, there was messing with the presentation of figures in a range of areas, from fiscal adjustments to reduction in public service numbers. However, the brass neck award has to go to the attempt to claim that budget policy has been progressive. On page 10 of his speech, Minister Noonan talked about how we have one of the most progressive tax systems in the developed world, and said the role of recent budgets in this were contained in an annex. When you take... Yeah. Yes, it is. Yes.
Please.
When you take the time to look at the annex, you discover that the only reason our tax system is progressive is because of two budgets which every member of this cabinet voted against. Against. That's why it's the most progressive budget. Every one of you voted against it. You're right, it's a fact that it's progressive, but you voted against the two key budgets that made it so progressive. Every measure in it. And if you actually include just the budgetary decisions of Fine Gael and Labour, you find a deeply regressive impact. The backing away from a real reform of the political and budgetary process has been obvious to anyone paying attention. Last year's budget fortnight has been abandoned and a traditional budget day restored. In the Iraq, this discussion was allowed in advance of the estimates, but there is nothing in what has been published which even slightly reflects Iraq's input. Within government, the increasingly ineffective Economic Management Council has destroyed collective responsibility, with ministers actively distancing themselves from unpopular decisions on the basis that they weren't properly consulted. Sitting around Taoiseach doing nothing for hours and ordering in pizza might be okay for teenagers with a few days off, but it's not what you expect from a cabinet. What the final budget decision revealed is a government which holds many meetings with outside groups but rarely ever listens to what is being said. How else can you explain all the meetings with children's organisations which have been followed by the targeting in this budget of families with children? Yesterday's announcement that 100 Garda stations will be closed will likely lead to demonstrations throughout the country. When closing stations, the government repeatedly said that they were only marginal stations, which were more trouble than benefit. In seeking to close 100 stations, this excuse is irrelevant. It is a programme to radically change policing in Ireland by making it more distant from the community and exposing large sections of the country to significantly reduced coverage. If you believe that Gardaí make a difference to keeping us safe, and I have no doubt that this is the case, then you must accept that this radical and dangerous proposal must be stopped before it goes any further. As I said earlier, every one of the welfare cuts imposed in this budget could have been avoided if the proposal to target the highest income earners had been adopted. Instead, Fine Gael insisted that social welfare must feel the pain, and Minister Burton went about designing a set of cuts which is deeply mean-spirited. Families with children have been singled out for major cuts in their income. Last year, the government told us that Scandinavian childcare was on the way. This year, the Fine Gael Labour vision of Scandinavian childcare is being implemented, with cuts to child benefit, taxing of maternity benefit, cuts to clothing and footwear allowances, and a handful of extra childcare places. When she was in opposition, Minister Burton liked nothing more than to find ways of attacking welfare packages, no matter how generous they were. She was particularly happy to have coined the term, and I quote, "savage 16", and said of the minister concerned, and I quote, "her actions make Margaret Thatcher look like a socialist", unquote. Today, the conscience of the Labour Party in government is justifying cuts which are dramatically more severe and targeted against the most vulnerable. When challenged about cutting basic support for clothing and footwear, her callous response is to tell people, and I quote, "there's a lot of good value in the shops", unquote. The mounting evidence that the Department of Health is out of control is clear to everyone in the country but the Taoiseach. Even other cabinet ministers are saying that Minister Riley is turning tough conditions into a crisis. In this budget, we see more about the truth of a regressive and cynical health policy. The move by the government to restrict the over-70s medical card is especially shameless, given their past campaigning on this issue. Minister Riley actually put down a motion demanding an extension to medical card eligibility and said it was merited because, and I quote, here's what Minister Riley said 2 years ago. "Those are the people," he said, "who made this country what it is today. They raised us," he said. "They nursed us. And when we were sick, protected us from violence, grew our food," unquote. This is Minister Riley not so long ago in this House about medical cards for over 70s. And Taoiseach, you joined in with great gusto in that debate as well. And I have all your speeches in a fairly large file demonstrating your hypocrisy and your lack of sincerity a short while ago. And I would say that Minister Riley's speech on that occasion may well rate in history alongside Minister Quinn's visit to the front gate of Trinity College for breathtaking cynicism.
What happened there?
That was the breaking, of course, of a promise made before the election. The trebling of prescription charges does that and adds to it the breaking of a post-election announcement. Remember, Minister Riley was only days in office when he summoned journalists to hear that he intended not just cutting, but abolishing prescription charges.
They can't even keep the promise.
And,
They
Taoiseach,
have to do that.
and this prescription charge, the prescription charge of 150, I mean, many pensioners are on medication, by definition. Many would use 6 to 9 items a month. And so you may not cut the old age pension, but through this measure alone, for an awful lot of pensioners, you're taking about 20 euros off them, 1950, as a result of the prescription charge. So you kind of fulfill your election rhetoric by saying, well, we don't do the core rates. But you get them in other ways. You get people in other ways. It's a complete cynical approach that you've adopted.
You're taxing the house.
And could I ask you, Taoiseach,
Please.
could I ask you, Taoiseach, if I may, the cut, Taoiseach, in the respite care grant is particularly callous when added on top of the cuts to home helps. And how, in the name of God, can you put out thousands of leaflets claiming to have delivered a fair budget when you've done something like this? Now, I heard people on the radio this morning. I heard people on the radio this morning. I heard carers on the radio interrupting Minister Howland with a passion and a conviction that left the minister speechless on the radio this morning. This is something, Taoiseach, that I would ask you. I would ask you, Taoiseach, to reverse this. Mistakes were made in the last budget as well. Appalling attacks on DESH schools. The most disadvantaged schools were hit in last year's budget. We fought a campaign against that, and you eventually reversed the cuts to DESH schools. And Minister Quinn came in and he apologised for what he did. Now, I would put it to you, Taoiseach, to look at this again. The saving identified is about 26 million. 1 second, Deputy.
Deputy, please.
26 million.
I have some respect for the Speaker, please. Right, Deputy. Oh. Elaine Rutherford, Deputy Martin.
May I continue? 26 million is involved. 26 million is involved here, Taoiseach. I think people watching are not interested in that kind of tomfoolery. They're interested basically can anything be done in relation to the respite grant? I'm saying to you, it can be done, and it should be done. And I'm making a plea to you today, Taoiseach. This is what this debate's about, for people to listen to what we're saying and to take on board some of it, at least a bit of it. And I would respectfully say, of all the things that have been done here, restore that respite grant, because it's going to people who care 24/7 for relatives, for people with severe disabilities and in special needs. And if we respect the caring ethos, which is fundamental to how we look after the elderly in this country and those with special needs, because the state, in many instances, isn't doing all it would like to do for carers and for people who are being cared for. I think the very least, on reflection and hearing what people across the floor are saying, the very least is, and you have time in the context of the social welfare bill, you have time. And we will be bringing forward amendments to secure the elimination of this decision and the restoration of the grant, because we brought it up to this level, because we do think, at least even for those who are not in receipt of carers allowance, for quite a number, it can be very, very helpful to them. And most of the people ringing in this morning and contacting offices are saying they treat it as a payment that helps them to do very basic things like heating, transport, and to keep their situation going and the household thing going. So I think it's very important that you would look at that again. In the third largest department, education and skills, cuts are once again being targeted at disadvantaged families and communities. The increases in third level fees will continue, and now an effort has been made that more and more families have to pay these fees. Combining an increase with a reduction in eligibility for grants means that the reversal of advances in equal access will be accelerated. I don't understand why you did that sneaky underhand move on the means thresholds in relation to third level grants, because in the end of the day, education will be central to coming out of this crisis. And we want young people to continue to go on to third level and fourth level teaching. And because of the mess of Susie, it's the first time in a long time I have met students on the streets who were saying they were contemplating leaving college. Because then it's true. I was in Castlebar 3 weeks ago, and a young student doing biomedical engineering in UCG said he was contemplating leaving because the grant hadn't come through and he had no information about it. I don't like saying that. I don't like saying that. No, wrong. Wrong. Look, the students have no confidence in you, Deputy Costello. The only image The only image that is
Minister.
no, the only image that is embedded in the minds of students is Rory Quinn, Minister Rory Quinn, on the steps of Trinity College. That's their perception of this government. Swearing blind, on the dotted line signing that he would reverse the student contribution charge and he would not increase it. And yesterday we discover it'll be well over 1,000. Now that's what students across this country say about Rory Quinn. So don't try and tell me that you're trying to improve the situation for students, because you are not. And I think it's regressive in the sense that we do need people, we need to encourage students to, if at all possible, to get through education. You're talking about the last 14 years. The most important statistic to come out in the last 3 weeks about Irish education was that we have a 90% completion rate now in second level. And that's because of the decisions we took, strategic decisions about second level completion and investment that have moved second level completion rates from 78% to 90% in a decade. And we want to do the same at third level. We've one of the highest participation rates of third level now, of second level students going into third level, of any European Union country. And that's because of a sustained, agreed approach to third level education. And don't throw it away now. And don't undermine what is a key strategic intervention in terms of getting the country out of this crisis and enabling people. And the problem is the bit of delegation that went on here yesterday in the budget, giving the Higher Education Authority a €25 million cut, but claiming that no services will be impacted. It's simply not credible. And of course the HEA will have to take the hit when it starts doing what it has to do with a 25 million cut. And the government will be at one remove, and the minister will be at one remove, and that's why, and that's the decision. And the same goes for the unspecified cut. The same goes for the unspecified cut of 13 million for the VCs. So you tell the VCs, look after 13 million. And when it happens on the ground, it's not the government to be blamed. It's not Rory Quinn, Minister Quinn will be blamed. It's some anonymous group. We did. So you're wrong. That's a spurious political claim. We costed our budget proposals. We put parliamentary questions down and got responses.
Yes.
So I hope you're not suggesting. I hope, Deputy Costello, you're not suggesting that the parliamentary replies are dishonest or untrue or inaccurate. Is that what you're suggesting? We look at the replies in good faith that they're accurate, that they tell us the truth. Maybe they don't. No, I do. I will acknowledge that we've had to use freedom of information requests much more frequently because of the reluctance of government to give information to the House and to deputies on numerous occasions. This year's shambolic introduction of a household charge proved that there's no public acceptance of a family home charge. As the Troika have repeatedly said, it is up to the Irish government to decide how it raises its money. No one is forcing the government to introduce a family home tax. Before the election, Fine Gael said that such a tax is unfair and would not be introduced. That's what you said before the election, Taoiseach. Labour said nothing should be done before 2014 and that it must, under no circumstances, be a flat tax. The government's proposal is for an unjust tax, which is weighted against urban areas. It does not have and will not earn public support because of its unfairness, and it could cause much wider problems. It is even more unfair to introduce such a tax in the context of the rising social and economic impact of mortgage and household debt in our economy, with 1 in 5 mortgages in arrears. And the lack of any major initiative on this area yesterday was striking. As Fianna Fáil has set out in its pre-budget document, the measures announced yesterday are not inevitable. They are the product of political choices between parties manoeuvring for position, and they are bad choices. They will increase the already rising sense of unfairness about who is bearing the load of reducing our deficit. They will damage the confidence which is vital for a return to growth in our domestic economy. They will make our country less safe by withdrawing community policing from large sections of the country. They are being introduced without any overall strategy for growth or job creation, other than hoping that something will turn up in Europe. One of the most unmistakable traits of this budget is how it is so lacking in new ideas or a major initiative. Many small things are being done so that claims can be made to visionary leadership. But the difference between the rhetoric and the reality is growing every single day. The only significant departure in this budget is that the government has doubled down on its policy of implementing profoundly regressive cuts. No matter how often you claim, Taoiseach, that you are about fairness and job creation, the public simply will not buy it.